Hi guys, this would be 412, the Napoleonic Wars. Don't worry about it, take 5. We left off with all of the positive things that Napoleon did for the citizens of France. He gave them roads, infrastructure, laws, a code of law, a banking system, all sorts of wonderful things. And he decides that he needs a title. He had been first consul, and he thought that that title didn't reflect his power. So he decides he wants to be emperor. And on Christmas Day, 1804, Napoleon will be crowned emperor. And he decides, and as has happened for centuries, when a king is selected or coronated, they like to have someone perform the ceremony who is legitimate. That makes it seem that, yes, this is truly the king or the emperor or whoever the ruler is. So Napoleon decides that he would like to get that legitimacy by inviting the Pope. Remember, in 1801, he restored the Catholic Church to France. So it's okay to be Catholic, sort of the symbol of we're bringing back the church. So he says, we're going to go to Notre Dame. It's no longer the Temple of Reason. It's back to being a church. He says, Pope, you can come all the way from Rome. It's winter. Take you a couple weeks to get here. That's fine. But I want you to be the one to crown me emperor. So at that moment, he's in Notre Dame. He's got all these fancy robes on. The Pope is about to crown him. And Napoleon reaches up and grabs the crown himself. He places the crown on his own head and is symbolizing that no one is superior to Napoleon, even the church, even the Pope, that Napoleon is superior. He is the one in charge. And then Napoleon crowns his wife. So this is a close-up of one of that famous image when he was about to crown his wife. If you look at the bishops and the church members in the background, they do not look pleased. They still cannot quite believe what has just happened. And again, not only did it happen, but this painting is part of the imagery. What he wants you to think happened. This is the large scale. It's a huge painting, again, by Jacques-Louis David, same painter who did the tennis court oath, same one who made the sketch of Marie Antoinette on the way to the guillotine. You can see the Pope sort of in the right-hand third of the painting, sitting down, not looking pleased. You have this very well-dressed court. It almost looks like there is a light from God coming down onto Napoleon, which definitely is perception, not fact. This was in Notre Dame, which is notoriously a very dark cathedral. Also, since it had been disused, the church, it was not maintained. The finishes were bad, it was crumbling, and so Napoleon had to have all of these tapestries installed. But the image, this is the image we remember, not, the darkness of it or the people who were or weren't there. Just to give you a sense of how large this is. Here's me again, looking really happy. That history stuff. So now that Napoleon is emperor, he decides he needs an empire. You can't just call yourself an emperor if you don't have the territory to back it up. So he's now emperor. He is an absolute leader. He has crowned himself. His crown isn't like a normal crown like we would think of. It's a golden laurel wreath. The same type of crown that the emperors of ancient Rome used. Again, he's referencing back to ancient Rome. He's trying to sort of restore in many ways the glory of that type of empire. But the question I have is, how different is this? I mean, it's pretty similar to the absolute leader they had just, rid the country of a few years before. Sure, the color's different. One red, one blue. One gold, one silver. But beyond that, Napoleon has come full circle. He supported the revolution. He wanted to be all about people's rights and the citizens. And now he got a little bit of power, and he wants more. This is what happens. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. One thing that Napoleon is going to do to get more territories, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can do it through battle. That's the most popular. It's probably the easiest. Another is annexation. To annex something means you control it, but indirectly. These territories will have some degree of independence, of freedom, but at the end of the day, their ruler will be someone who has been approved by Napoleon. So we have win through battle and say, okay, you are part of France. We have made you part of our country. There's annexation. You're next door. We conquered you, but you still get to be independent. Just at the end of the day, you report to us. And then the other level is just friends. That Napoleon sort of wants to end some of the wars, create friendships, and build alliances with a lot of these countries in France or around Europe. Excuse me. With especially the territories that he has annexed, Napoleon is going to put his relatives in positions of power. So he becomes friends and eventually annexes Spain. His brother becomes the king of Spain. He annexes parts of Italy. He puts his cousin in as the king of Italy so that he can make sure that these sort of independent territories, at the end of the day, answer back to him. One country that's not included in any of this is Great Britain. They are still separate. They still hate France. And there's, one reason that they're not part of the empire is geographically they are separate. So Britain is able to never succumb to Napoleon's power. He gets pretty much all of the continent of Europe, but he still wants Great Britain. And Great Britain looks down at what's happening on the continent, and they're a little freaked out that this one guy, this one country, has that much power. And because Napoleon has so much power, because Napoleon has taken so much power, because he has instilled his family members in positions of power, this actually will lead to more nationalism across Europe. Countries saying, we want to be Italian, or we want to be German, or we want to be Swiss. We don't want to follow the rules of another country, of someone who's not like our people. Because, I love these political cartoons. Here he is. Napoleon is Versailles in the middle, or actually Fontainebleau. On the right is Russia. On the left is Spain. And he is trying to extend his empire, and he's trying to reach on stilts, but he is extending too far. He will eventually lose power, and that is the orb and scepter that look like they're falling, symbols of imperial power. He will stretch too far. His eyes will be too big for his stomach. That process begins just a year after he becomes emperor at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. This is against Great Britain specifically. Part of why Napoleon wants to beat Britain is because of their navy. Britain's navy is still the best. Napoleon is trying to establish that he is the best, so he feels the need to try and defeat Great Britain again. He tried in Egypt in the 1790s. He's going to try again. In this case, it specifically happens because the British were trying to prevent French merchant ships from reaching France. They're trying to disable Napoleon's economic power. They end up getting into a fight over it, and it is the French Navy versus the British Navy. The British ships are commanded by Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson. And just like in Egypt, Nelson whoops Napoleon again. This is off the southern coast of Spain, because the French ships were trying to get into the Mediterranean to the port of Marseille. Lord Nelson is actually killed as a result of this battle, but he becomes really one of the biggest heroes. He was a hero in Egypt, and because of this major battle, Nelson will become a hero because, as a result, Napoleon realizes he cannot defeat the British Navy, that nobody can defeat the British Navy. He gives up on his dream of controlling all of Europe. He'll just have to deal with having the continent. So because this is such an important battle in British culture, Trafalgar Square was named after the Battle of Trafalgar. It's one of the biggest squares in all of London. That is Nelson's column, Lord Nelson standing at the top. He has his sword in his left hand. There's nothing in his right hand because he doesn't have a right arm. In years earlier, he lost his right arm in battle. Even with one arm, he still is able to defeat Napoleon. And it was a fierce battle. If you see the upper left, the French ship, and then there is HMS Victory, the British ship that Nelson commanded. It wasn't completely equal. There was some give and take, but the end result is that Britain is superior, and this kills Napoleon. He hates it. This is where the idea of his pride comes in. It demonstrates that he's a loser, so he needs to do something else to repair his reputation. Again, here's a look at that map. The dark blue territories that are directly controlled by France. They are France. The medium blue, territories that have been annexed, controlled indirectly. They have freedom, but at the end of the day, the answer to France. And then the lighter blue are allies, and eventually Russia will be added to that as well. The problem with all this, with all of Napoleon's power, is that the people around Europe, they don't like it. As a way to retaliate against Britain, Napoleon decides to blockade all of the continent to prevent all British merchant ships from reaching ports in Europe, from being able to trade with European countries. Now, I understand why he does this. He can't defeat them militarily. He'll try to hurt their economy. It's called the Continental System because Napoleon is trying to cut off the continent of Europe from Great Britain. The problem is, the continent of Europe liked trading with Britain. Even the countries that Napoleon controls, even these annexed countries, the people say, wait a minute, we really like the products that we buy from Britain. They're an important part of our economy. So this completely backfires. Even his brothers and his cousins and all these family members say, the people are unhappy. That wasn't a good idea, Napoleon. As a result, there is more nationalism. More people are unhappy with what Napoleon had done. He was hoping that they would turn towards French products and that would help his economy in addition to hurting Britain. But it just doesn't happen. Portugal is one country that wasn't a part of Napoleon's empire. It still is on the continent. It's on the very, very edge, very eastern edge. Portugal never becomes part of Napoleon's empire. It's on the very western edge of the continent. They were able to hold out against the continental system, and this is again a blow to Napoleon's ego. He must control him. He feels this need to control Europe. So he decides to invade Portugal. He will force them into submission, marches through Spain, gets Spanish troops, and ends up fighting the Portuguese and also a little bit the Great British, because the British see Portugal as the example of someone who is succeeding, who is holding out against Napoleon. So it's Spanish troops versus Portuguese troops, but we would call this a proxy war. It's really about Britain fighting France. This is called the Peninsular War because it's on the Iberian Peninsula. And you'd think the French army is huge. They're the best army in Europe at the time, but because of the support of the British and this tactic called guerrilla warfare. The Peninsular War actually goes on for about 6 years. Now, guerrilla warfare is different than what was considered standard warfare of the time. At the time, it would have been normal to line up your army on one side of the field, and your enemy lines up on the other, and you march towards each other and shoot. That's the simplified version. Guerrilla warfare is often used by rebel groups, and in this case, by the natives in Portugal. You are using the territory to your advantage, whether that means you hiding behind a hill, attacking, and then running away. It might be seen as cowardly, but it's effective. So the natives of Portugal are using this guerrilla warfare because they know the terrain. This means that Napoleon is engaged in another war for a chunk of time, that he must devote troops and resources and funds and time and energy, that, this is a drain on the other places that he must rule. So his empire starts falling apart. He starts losing friends. In 1809, Austria says, we're not benefiting from this relationship. It's not me, it's you. And so Austria says, we are no longer friends. We do not have an agreement anymore. Napoleon is put off by this. He can't believe that someone would want to leave this agreement. But then it gets worse when Russia leaves the continental system. Does not want to suffer any longer under this economic system that Napoleon creates. And now Napoleon is really hurt. He must find some way to repair his reputation. So his grand idea is to invade Russia, because that's what everyone should do when they're upset with Russia. So in 1812, the summer of 1812, Napoleon leaves France with over 420,000 soldiers. I think the full number is about 422,000. And he is going to, through his military strength, win back Russia. Now, the three things that we know about Russia, that we have studied, that we've talked about, are that Russia is large, cold, and full of Russians. This is why it's a bad idea to invade Russia. So Bad Decision Dinosaur thinks this is great. Anybody with any logic thinks this is not great. This is why. Russia is really, really huge and it's far away. To get from France to Russia requires, in 1812, that soldiers and armies march. They don't fly, they don't take a train, they don't take a bus, they march. By the time Napoleon and his armies get to Russia, it's September. It took them most of the summer to get across Europe. So now they're in Russia and it's summer, beautiful time of year. And they cross over the border into Russia. They are ready to fight the Russian army. So the French army progresses, and the Russian army doesn't meet them. The Russian army actually runs away. Now, partly this is because the Russian army was much smaller. The French have a massive army. So every time the Russian army moves away, the French army goes further. Russian army moves away. The French army goes further. This is part of a tactic called scorched earth. As the Russian army is pulling deeper into Russia, they say to the villagers, to the peasants of Russia, "Hi, sorry to disturb you, but you need to evacuate your village. We, the Russian army, we're going to destroy it, and we're going to destroy your crops." Now, very sad for the Russian peasants who had their livelihood destroyed, but the reason is the Russian army needs to make sure that Napoleon and his troops will not be able to benefit from the land. At this time, you would take supplies with you, but the army would rely on living off the land, living off crops and the supplies that they found along the way. So the Russian army is quite literally scorching the earth. They are burning the land to make sure there is nothing for Napoleon and his armies to benefit from. Finally, in about October, about 100 miles outside of Moscow, the Russian army finally stops, and Napoleon is ready to meet them on the field of battle. This is the Battle of Borodino. And because the Russian army is much smaller, they actually do retreat. So Napoleon sees this finally as a victory. He can beat the Russians, and he has a clear way to get into Moscow. So this will be symbolic. He'll march into Moscow, he'll be victorious, and he will once again restore his reputation. The problem is, so this is exactly what the Tsar wanted. This is exactly what the Russians wanted. By the time Napoleon gets to Moscow, it's about late November, which means it's pretty much winter. And his army is stuck because Moscow has been evacuated. The Tsar already had everyone leave Moscow, and most of the city has been burned down. There is nothing left for Napoleon or his armies. At this point, it's very cold. The soldiers only have the summer coats that they left with a couple months ago. They are running out of food. There's nothing to loot or for them to use in the city. So Napoleon has to make the choice: do I keep my army in Moscow and let them starve? Or do I start on the journey home and they starve along the way? And he decides to go home. Eventually, by the time he reaches France, about early in 1813, he only has 10,000 soldiers left. Of over 420,000 soldiers, only 10,000 survive. That is a huge loss. Massive, absolutely massive. But it doesn't really matter to Napoleon because what he cares about is his reputation and his pride. So check out the video on Canvas. It explains sort of how that battle goes. To restore his pride, okay, I can't let Russia win. So Napoleon is able to gather another army, and by this point, other countries in Europe have joined with Russia against France. So they meet in Germany at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. It is Napoleon versus Europe. He has lost so many soldiers that he does, in fact, lose this battle. He's forced to retreat. Once again, a blow to his pride. He runs away back to Paris, and just a few months later, these European armies, just very casually, without the need to do this quickly, they march into Paris, led by the Russian troops. They march into Paris, and they force Napoleon to surrender. So he now must give up his power, give up his empire, and this is March 1814. So everything that Napoleon did to try and build up his power, build up his ego, has failed. Absolutely failed. And that's why I love this picture. It is sort of the image of the sad, loner, losery guy. Every plan he had fails because it's all based on his pride, not on what was best for the people or best for Europe. So the allies of Europe, all of Europe decides, okay, we need to get rid of Napoleon. He shouldn't be in power anymore. Let's exile him. They sent him to the island of Elba, which is just off the coast of Italy. You can see on the smaller map there. It's in between Corsica and Italy. Remember, Napoleon wasn't going back to Corsica anymore. He was seen as a bit of a criminal. But Elba's quite lovely. Today you could drive across in about 35, 40 minutes. It's not a bad way to live. But he is mocked by many people as he was the emperor of Europe. Now he is the emperor of this little island. So few people. But actually, he's like, well, if I'm going to be here, I might as well make the best of it. He improves the government of Elba. He streamlines. He does some of the same things he did for the citizens of France. He has to make himself useful somehow. He has a nice house to live in. He has money to spend. He has troops to protect him. For me personally, I think this sounds like a good deal, but you got to remember what his level of expectation was. He wants greatness. He wants an empire. So Elba is just not enough. Even though he lives in this beautiful house, it still isn't enough. So he has to come up with what should he do next. Meanwhile, back in France, they need a government. So they decide to go to Louis XVI's younger brother, who will now be Louis XVIII. And you say, well, what happened to 17? That was the little boy who was in the Temple prison who died alone. Louis XVIII grew up in Versailles, grew up with the estate system, younger brother of our King Louis XVI. He now is an adult. He had sort of run away, didn't know if he would ever get to be royal again, and now he has a chance to be royal. This is a great opportunity for him. But it's not the same type of royalty he grew up with. It is a constitutional monarchy. The people of France they weren't going to give up all of their rights. They weren't going to give up all of the powers that they had earned or taken in the revolution. But they do fear that Louis XVIII will try to roll back and get rid of all of those changes to the government. He grew up in the estate system. He was used to total absolute power. So they were afraid that he would go back to this, and the people don't really like him. So then Napoleon is able to escape Elba. He disguises himself, gets on a ship that's disguised to be English, and lands at the port of Marseille. And from the time he lands in Marseille, it'll be 100 days until the next big event. The king sends troops to go arrest him. And all of the troops, because they love Napoleon still, after everything, the people love Napoleon. They welcome him back. And Napoleon eventually reaches Paris. In that time, newly crowned Louis XVIII gets the heck out of me. He goes, wait a minute, this guy's back? He's probably going to want to kill me because I took his power and all of that. So the people, the citizens, welcome back Napoleon because of all of the good that he did for them. People are willing to overlook things that are inconvenient or unpleasant in general, as long as they personally will benefit from it. Amazingly, Napoleon is able to compile a new army. 200,000 soldiers are willing to sign up to fight for him. And Napoleon now, he has to restore that pride. He has to prove to Europe that he is superior. So he's going to head towards modern-day Belgium to fight the British and Prussian troops who are still sort of hanging out in England after the Battle of Leipzig and the Battle of Nations. Let's check out this video on Waterloo. The major battle that happens in Belgium is known as the Battle of Waterloo. With the British and Prussian armies, they were all clumped together. Napoleon's grand plan is to conquer and divide. If he can separate them, if he can wedge the French army between them, he can concentrate on one at a time. Remember, Napoleon went to military school. He was a brilliant tactician. He knew all the maneuvers, but he also had a huge ego. And that ego, once again, gets in the way. On the morning of the battle, it had rained sort of that morning and that evening. The field was muddy. And in Napoleon's plan, he needed the artillery. He needed to wheel the cannons to specific locations. And it was too muddy for him to do that. So he decided to wait to let the sun come up a little bit higher, dry out some of the land. And in that time, while he is waiting to have this perfect plan as he sees it in his mind, the British and Prussian troops are able to surround him. So once again, Napoleon is defeated on a huge scale. This is why, when someone makes a mistake or someone has a personal crisis and they make a mistake, it's called their Waterloo, because this was such a huge mistake on Napoleon's part. Once again, the British do get a hero out of it. Our first one was Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson, and now we have the Duke of Wellington. He was the commander of the British troops. And where Trafalgar Square is commemorating Lord Admiral Nelson, the Duke of Wellington gets rain boots named after him. If you are ever in Great Britain, it's raining, you might need a pair of wellies, or you're out in the mud, wear a pair of wellies, named after Wellington because the muddy battlefields. And there's also beef Wellington, which is quite delicious. So Trafalgar Square and Nelson, and delicious dinner and footwear for Trafalgar Square for Admiral Lord Nelson, and footwear and a delicious dinner named after Duke of Wellington. Seems like a pretty even place for me. Both are excellent options. So again, the countries of Europe have to decide, well, what do we do with Napoleon? We could send him back to Elba, but he escaped. So instead, they find an island out in the middle of the ocean off the western tip of Africa called St. Helena. 2,000 miles from anything. It is really in the middle of nowhere. It takes forever to get there. It is constantly circled by 2 British naval ships. Yes, that is expensive. It's a hassle. It's an investment. But to the European countries, it is worth it to make sure that Napoleon can never, ever escape and can never wreak that kind of damage on Europe again. He dies 6 years later in 1821. So even with all of the negative, the horrible things that Napoleon did, this is his grave. This doesn't look like the grave of a villain. He still was a hero to the French citizens. As many soldiers that died, there are thousands, millions more who benefited from Napoleon's rule. It's really the rest of Europe that was negatively impacted. Okay, that's it, guys, for 412.